Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to Bali, and today I want to talk to you about a brand new lens for the Lumix L mount system, and that is the Samyang 35-150 f2-2.8. Now, I've had this lens for a couple of weeks now. I've been able to test it under a variety of conditions, and I can honestly say at this point that this is definitely the most versatile lens available for the L mount system today, but also probably one of the best lenses available for the L mount system today. So in this video, I'm going to go over some of the features, a bit about the lens. I'm going to show you some examples I've taken, talk about image quality, sharpness, autofocus, things like that, who I think this lens is good for, who I don't think will find this lens useful, and then kind of just give an overall opinion at the end of the video. Now, firstly, a little bit of a disclaimer. I purchased this lens myself. Samyang didn't send it to me. They've got no idea that I'm making this video. I'm just doing it as part of my normal YouTube routine. That being said, I do think this lens is really good. I will give my honest opinion about it. There are a couple of things I find a little bit weird about the lens I will talk about, but I mean, right from the start, I would say this lens is about as close to a 10 out of 10 as you can get at the moment. A little bit about the ergonomics of the lens. It's obviously quite big, quite beefy. It's a little bit bigger than the 24-70, the Lumix 24-70, certainly smaller than the Lumix 70-200. It weighs about 1,200 grams, whereas the 24-70 weighs about 1,100, so it's not that much heavier. In normal day-to-day use, it certainly feels about the same when it's on one of my Panasonic cameras as the Lumix 24-70. But yeah, it is definitely slightly heavier. It's got an 82mm filter on the front, which is, I believe, the same as the 24-70 and 70-200. You have these custom buttons on the side which you can program for different things if you want. You have an autofocus, manual focus button. You have these three custom switches, which according to Samyang's site, number 1 and number 2 make it parafocal, and number 3 gives it a dolly zoom effect. I don't know whether that's coming in a future firmware update, but currently that doesn't work, and I'm not sure if there is a way to make it customizable to whatever you like. Yeah, then you have your zoom ring. It starts at 35mm at f2, goes all the way to 150mm at f2.8, and that it gradually increases the f-stop as you go through those that range. So it doesn't just jump from f2 to 2.8 as you go through. Goes to 2.1, 2.2, all the way through to the 150mm where it's f2.8. And as you go backwards and forwards, the camera remembers where it was at. So if you go to 150, it will go to 2.8. You go back to 35, it will drop back down to f2. It is weather sealed, which is good. I don't think I would use a lens if it didn't have weather sealing these days. But yeah, it's a very heavy duty lens. It feels really solid in your hands. It doesn't feel cheap and plasticky. I used to own some of the Samyang and Rokinon lenses some years ago when they were still a cheap company. And I have to say that they've come leaps and bounds from what they used to be, because it used to, they used to feel cheap. And the image quality was okay at best. It wasn't fantastic, but this is a fantastic lens. So I've got almost no qualms about it at the moment. One thing I did notice on the old Sony lenses when I looked at reviews is that the barrel drops when you're using it. I've tried to make the barrel drop. I think they might have fixed that issue, either made it tighter. Whether that changes over time as it gets a little bit looser, I don't know. If you pull on it, it will definitely come out, but just normally it's not gonna come out. So yeah, let's go through the lens, the features, show you some examples, things like that. So we'll start talking about the autofocus for both photo and video. Now, I have to say right from the start, the autofocus is very snappy. It was easy to focus from something very close to something very far away, all the way through the focal ranges at different f-stops in both photo and video. But yeah, let's look at some examples. So I took it out and I gave it the hardest challenge that I could. I was shooting at tight focal lengths, wide open in burst mode with fast moving subjects coming towards me. That was these scooters and motorbikes and trucks in Bali. And it performed flawlessly. Like it barely dropped the frame. I think maybe one of these photos is slightly out of focus, but yeah, when things were moving towards me at speed, it was keeping up perfectly fine in both photo and video. I mean, it's definitely hard to believe that these newer Panasonic cameras behave the way that they do with the autofocus. Like when you consider where we've come from with the GH5, the S1, S1H, the original S5, they were just terrible. They just would not have performed as well as this one has. But yeah, it's definitely very rarely drop focus, if at all. So then moving on to, I guess, another aspect for video production is the focus breathing. I wanted to check whether this thing would focus breathe. It's very well controlled, basically no focus breathing. If you look at the edges of the frame here, everywhere from 35 to 150, there's basically no zooming in or out as it shifts from near to far focus. I'd definitely say that this is one of the best performing lenses for focus breathing that I've used, and that includes against the Panasonic lenses that I have. But yeah, it behaved very, very, very well. I've got no complaints at all when it comes to focus breathing. Now, is it parafocal? Samyang claimed that on those first two custom modes, it is parafocal. It's not parafocal. It stays almost parafocal from 35 to about 100. I don't think the focus point changes too much at that point. Once you go from 100 to 150, the focus point definitely moves further away. So it's certainly not parafocal. I wouldn't use it as a parafocal lens anyway because it is variable aperture. So as you're moving, as you're zooming through that range, it's going to change the exposure. So although I guess if you were setting it at 2.8 at the start and moving through, then potentially parafocal lens would be handy in that situation. So yeah, so that's the autofocus component of it. Let's talk about the manual focus component of it. So one curiosity with this lens is even when I've set it within the Lumix camera to linear focus, the lowest that I can set the focus ring is 360 degrees, which I would much prefer to have that at 180 degrees or even 90 degrees, because if you're focusing on something really close to really far away, especially when you're at the tighter focal lengths, a 360 degree throw is a lot, and you often are going to have some camera movement as you try to twist through. The manually focusing between objects that are just outside the plane of each other is pretty easy and intuitive, but pulling focus between objects that are far away does involve a lot more work. I'd love to see Samyang and Lumix work together to maybe create a firmware update where they can change that, that focus throw in the future. Hopefully that will come in a further firmware update. Obviously they're still on firmware 1.0, the lens has only just been released. But yeah, maybe in the future we'll see the ability to change the focus throw. That all being said, when you want to throw focus from something really close to really far away, the autofocus actually behaves really well. It doesn't hunt when it jumps between something that's really far away and really close. Even at the tighter focal lengths, it behaves really, really, really well. But it's something that if you're shooting video, you're going to want to have a little bit more control over than what the autofocus does. So yeah, let's talk about the stepping of the focus. Now in the Panasonic 24-70, when you're manually focusing, especially on things that are up close, you can actually see the focus jump slightly forwards and backwards as you go backwards and forwards. So I wanted to see whether this lens did that. And I'm happy to say that it doesn't. It looks very smooth, even when I slow it down. There may be a slight amount of jumping, but it's certainly nowhere near as noticeable as what the 24-70 Lumix does. So yeah, let's now jump into, I guess, the image quality side of the lens, which is probably one of the most important things behind the usability of it. There's definitely softness around the edges of the frame when it's wide open. The moment you stop that down though, it gets very sharp around the edges across the whole frame. So it's probably not the ideal lens if you were going to be shooting something like landscapes at wide open apertures. But for things like portraits and weddings and events and stuff, quite often you don't really care about the softness on the edge. It's more about what's in the center or just off center of frame. Interestingly though, at 35mm, I did notice that there is quite a lot of vignetting when it's wide open. The moment you stop that down, the vignetting pretty much disappears. It isn't all the way through the focal ranges, maybe from about 35 to about 50, you get that little bit of vignetting, but it definitely disappears the moment you stop the lens down. Again, for weddings, events, portraits, it may not be a big deal for you, but for landscapes and things like that, it probably is a bit more of a deal. You can definitely obviously remove that in post, in Lightroom and things like that, but it is definitely there, so it's something to keep in mind. Next, how does it hold up in backlit scenarios, I guess both for focus and for image quality? So we're talking when the sun's behind, we're talking lens flares, we're talking ghosting, things like that. So it held up pretty well. I'd say it's not quite as good as some of the Panasonic glass. The Panasonic glass performs really well in backlighting, but it's definitely better than the Sigma glass. And if you've ever had Sigma glass, you know that it has that like horrible green spots that pop up everywhere, which personally I really don't like. Some people love it, I hate it. But yeah, it holds up pretty well. You do get some okay Sunstars. I would just call them okay. I would say that they're not as good as the Panasonic ones when you stop down. There's also a little bit of like a rainbow effect in the flare when you stop down. It's definitely more pleasing than the green blotches you get with the Sigma glass, but again, it's not as nice as Panasonic lenses. Again, with backlit scenarios, we should talk about chromatic aberration. Now, if you don't know, chromatic aberration is where you get like a little bit of like purple or blue around the edges of sharp lines, especially when something's backlit. So probably the most common scenario is going to be like trees where there's lots going on with leaves and things like that. You often get chromatic aberration in those scenarios. Chromatic aberration is really well controlled. The only time you really begin to see it is when you have a really harsh backlight almost pointing directly at the sun. I don't think it's any worse than the Panasonic glass. The 24-70 actually does have quite a bit of chromatic aberration when you put it in the same scenario, but it's certainly nothing that I would be overly concerned about. It's quite easy to remove in post, and for photos, you can easily remove it in post in Lightroom. For video, it's not super strong, pretty easy to remove if you need to. But I don't think it will be super obvious for the average person. One of the other things I wanted to look at was if there's any barrel distortion. Now, the villa that I'm staying at here in Bali at the moment, if you know anything about Bali construction, none of the lines in here are straight. So it was not the easiest thing in the world to test. I tried anyway with some photos and stuff, and there's nothing obvious that I can see. I'd love to put it up against a brick wall at home where I know that the lines are straight and then see how it performs there when I get back home. But for the moment, I would pretty safely say that there's little to no barrel distortion. There's nothing that I've noticed that would suggest that there's any curvature in there at all. And you would expect that starting at 35mm, it would be very unusual to get any significant barrel distortion there. Let's talk about the bokeh of the lens. I think it's quite pleasing. I think they've done a really good job. I think that it looks great. I've got no issues at all with the bokeh there. They're certainly they're nice round bokeh balls. There's no like obvious cat's eyeing or anything. Even when you zoom right in, like everything still looks beautiful. Even when it's on the edge of the frame, you don't get like weird distortions of the bokeh. So yeah, I would say that the bokeh is nice. It's creamy. It's not distracting, which is the main thing. And obviously when you're shooting 2.8 at 150, you can get some like really creamy backgrounds. Talking about the macro performance, it's obviously not a macro lens. It doesn't behave like a macro lens. It's not close to a macro lens. So I wouldn't be using it for that sort of thing. The Panasonic 24-105 is actually a really good lens to use in that sort of scenario. Now, one of the questions that somebody asked me on one of the Lumix forums is the 35mm actually 35mm? And it's not really something that I'd considered. I hadn't even looked at it until they pointed it out. So I threw the 35mm from the Lumix on and the 35mm, and obviously set the Samyang to 35mm as well. And there was quite a big difference. The Samyang lens is definitely tighter than the Lumix 35. Now, whether that is that the Lumix 35 is slightly wider than 35mm, or whether it's the Samyang 35 is slightly tighter than 35mm, I'm not 100% sure. But the difference would probably be a few millimeters. So I would say maybe like it could even be that the Samyang's at like 37 or 38mm, not actually 35. Does this matter? I don't know. I don't think that you need to shoot at exactly 35mm. Could be like something that is important if you are worried about whether the Samyang is wide enough for what you want to shoot. Because I know for a lot of people, 35mm isn't wide enough for what they're actually wanting to do. But yeah, I think that it is something to bear in mind. So yeah, let's talk about the color rendering out of the lens. Obviously, different lenses behave in different ways when it comes to color rendering. For instance, I find that the 20-60 is actually quite saturated. I find the 24-70 Lumix is like really pleasant. And I have to say that the Samyang renders colors really pleasantly. It's quite beautiful colors, very natural to life, maybe slightly warmer and a slightly more green tint than the Lumix lenses. It's very minor though, yeah, ever so slightly warmer than the Lumix lenses that I have, but not enough that it would be a huge difference. A tiny bit of color correction if you're trying to match between lenses, tiny bit of white balance would fix that really easily. Yeah, so the image quality of the lens, it's fantastic. I think that it is, I said it right at the start, I think it is one of the best lenses on the L mount system that you can buy today. For me, I'm going to be using this to shoot weddings, mainly for photo, but also for video as well. For photo, I find it would be really helpful to have one lens run and gun to be able to shoot a variety of focal lengths very quickly, especially when you have such a wide aperture all the way through the lens. Yeah, just changing constantly between 35 and 85 all the time, and then having to switch lenses for the ceremony, and then switch lenses back for the portraits, and then switch lenses for the speeches. To be able to just rock up with a 35-150 and be able to shoot all day on that, it's going to mean that I can capture better quality images for the couples that I shoot for. It's going to mean that I can capture moments more quickly and not have to worry about, oh my God, which camera do I need to grab for that moment as it's happening. I can just hold the camera up, go to the focal length I need, shoot. So it just makes it so easy. Yeah. Now, before I go into the last bit, I wanted to talk about some weird issues that I had with the lens. Now, one of the other guys in the forum who's also made a YouTube video actually mentioned one of these issues. When I was shooting in burst mode, it weirdly came up with a message to say that the lens isn't attached to the camera, and I had to turn the camera off, pop the battery back in, then turn it back on again. I will submit that to Samyang support to see whether it's something that they can look at, see whether it's an issue on the Panasonic side or an issue on the lens side. Hopefully they can fix that, because you obviously don't want that to happen at a critical moment. But I've only had that happen while I was shooting burst mode in AFC. While I've just been firing off images one by one, it's been fine. I've not had it happen again. And I actually tried to have it, I tried to force it to happen again in AFC, and I couldn't get it to happen. So it's just a weird thing that happened once. The other really strange thing that I've had happen is it's the shutter speed when you shoot, and it's so what happens is you have the lens wide open, you have your shutter speed set, and you're shooting images, and you can feel the shutter in the camera going off. Now, the moment you stop down, so you keep exposure the same, you stop down, you leave the shutter speed where it is, and you adjust by ISO. So the shutter speed shouldn't change, but it feels noticeably slower in the camera. Now, this doesn't happen with any of the Panasonic lenses. It still feels exactly the same. It's just that when you stop down in this lens, all the way through the focal range, the moment you stop down, the shutter feels slower. Now, I've tested this. I was shooting a fan at a higher shutter speed, and I know that if I drop the shutter speed, then I'll be able to see motion blur in the fan. But when I was shooting, it felt slower, and then I brought it into Lightroom, and there was no motion blur in the fan. So obviously it is shooting at the same speed, but for some reason, I'm not sure why, it feels slower. It almost feels like you're shooting at like 1/50th or 1/40th of a second when it should be like 1/8000th of a second. So I don't know, again, I don't know whether this is something that will be fixed in firmware, whether it's a Panasonic issue or whether it's a Samyang issue, but it is something to keep in mind. Though even though it feels like it's slower, it actually isn't. Yeah, with all that being said, who is this lens useful for? I think for weddings and events, this is going to be a fantastic lens. I think that it's going to be like one and done. I don't think that you're going to have to worry about shooting on any other lens unless you particularly need a prime lens to shoot on. So if there are like very specific use cases for a prime lens, or if you need to go wider than 35, I think this lens will be able to do everything. And especially with the ISO performance of cameras these days, even later at night when you get into the party, F2 to 2.8 is going to be more than enough for almost every situation, especially if you're going to flash it. But even without flash, F2 to 2.8, you're still going to get some great images even in low light. So for weddings and events, I think it's fantastic. I think this will be a really good sports lens if you didn't need a reach beyond 150 millimeters. Again, for wildlife, I think if you didn't need reach beyond 150 millimeters, I think it's going to be a great lens as well. I would say that this would be a really good travel lens, except for the weight. Now, I just went on a big trip to Japan and I bought the 24-105, which is significantly lighter than this lens, and that felt like it weighed a ton by the end of the day when I was walking around with it. So I think that for travel, I would still use a lighter lens, purely because you don't want to get to the end of your day walking around and feel like you've just done the biggest workout of your life. And I feel like this lens would do that for you. If you're only bringing it out for maybe an hour here or there, then yeah, 100% it'll be a fantastic travel lens, especially if you were going to shoot some portraits of your family at the same time. But yeah, probably not the best travel lens available. But yeah, at the end of the day, is it worth it? Is it worth the price tag? It's about $2,300 Australian, maybe even a little bit more. I think I got it with a slight discount, but yeah, 2,300 Australian. I'm not 100% sure what it costs in the US, but I would imagine it's expensive. So it's definitely up there with some of the more expensive, like 24-70s, the Sigmas and the 70-200 with the Sigma as well. It's probably not quite as expensive as the Lumix Pros, but yeah, would I recommend it? Absolutely, 100% yes. If you are in the market for standard zoom that is going to cover both a 24-70 and a 70-200, this pretty much does it. It is a little bit tighter at the bottom end and not quite as long at the top end, but honestly, the difference between 150 and 200, in most situations, you can get away with that by using your legs to zoom rather than the actual lens. So yeah, 100% recommend it. Depending on how this performs at the next few weddings, I may even buy a second one and have one on my photo camera, one on my video camera, and then that's done, apart from the secondary cameras for ceremonies and stuff. But yeah, we'll see how that goes. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you've found that useful. If it helps you go and pick up a copy of the lens, that's awesome. If it helps you rule it out, that's also really good. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.